Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am Kim Buckley, Senior Director of the Weinberg College of Arts and Sciences Alumni Relations and Development Team. Welcome to today's virtual conversation. As many of you know, we started this virtual series in May to engage our supporters and alumni more closely with the work of the college, especially during this challenging time. Since then, our faculty, in conversation with Dean Randolph, have been delivering updates on cutting-edge research across a range of disciplines within the college. We hope that you, as individuals that are invested in and have invested in our community, have been enjoying these thought-provoking sessions on relevant and topical areas of scholarship. Today, we're in for a treat as Dean Randolph puts on his other hat, namely that of professor, and joins us for a look at European Renaissance art, as well as a little peek into what it was like to teach virtually this fall. Before we get started with Professor Randolph, a few practical matters. First, if you have any technical difficulties, please use the chat function at the bottom and we have someone on hand to help you. Second, to ensure we keep this conversational, please submit your questions through the Q&A button. You don't have to wait till the end. We will monitor the Q&A throughout. Now, a brief introduction. Dean Randolph is an art historian who's been Dean of Weinberg College since 2015. His scholarship focuses on the art and architecture of medieval and Renaissance Italy, with books like Engaging Symbols, which address the development of political symbolism in 15th century Florence, as well as Touching Objects, a study of tactility, intimacy, and art in the Renaissance. He oversees our beloved Weinberg College with its roughly 4,000 undergraduates, 1,500 graduate students, 650 faculty members, 26 academic departments, and over 34 interdisciplinary programs. As you all know, the college offers an interdisciplinary bachelor's encompassing the social, natural, and life sciences, as well as the arts and humanities. This fall quarter, a quarter like no other, 533 instructors offered 1,263 courses in the college to students from across Northwestern. One of those instructors was Adrian, who is going to tell us a bit about his experience both overseeing the college during this extraordinary time, teaching in the time of COVID, and then about his area of scholarship. Adrian, take it away.
Hey everyone, I hope you can hear me. I'm sorry if you had some trouble signing in. It's one of the beauties of online learning and virtual environments that we have these glitches, but it's great to be with you. I see many of your names in the chat or in the participants, but I'm afraid I can't see you, so I'm just speaking to the void, but I'm glad to know you're there. So I was going to today take a few moments to discuss both a little bit what it was like teaching at Northwestern in the fall term and a little bit in the spring as well, but also then just give you a little bit of an insight into what the subject matter of my course was, what I actually taught this fall. I had the great pleasure of teaching about 115 students from around the world in a course dedicated to early modern European art. And I'll get to some slides in a minute. First of all, I just want to allude to the complexity of the virtual turn we all took at Weinberg College in the spring, once COVID became visible as a true crisis. And that had repercussions across the university and across our enterprise, our research, our administration, but also, of course, our teaching. And I'm immensely proud of the instructors in the college who really, within a couple of weeks, entered this new virtual space of teaching using things like Zoom and recording our lectures in different ways and meeting with students virtually in office hours. All of this so quickly. I mean, people change their habits. I was one of the fortunate people who was not scheduled to teach in the spring, but was planning on teaching in the fall. So I had the summer to prepare. And one of the things I did is participated in one of the sessions that were called Practica or Practicums, which really were put together by experts from teaching and learning at NUIT, as well as colleagues at SBS, to help train up instructors like me who'd never taught in this environment and didn't have any familiarity with the technology necessary to do this, in a way that we not only attended to, pushing the right buttons and setting the right settings online, but also understood the pedagogical shift in mentality it takes to try to maintain a sense of intellectual community across these virtual media. And it was so useful, and I can't tell you how thankful I was to have some experts introduce me to some of the tools at my disposal. And that's going on. We have a whole new set of practica going on this winter for those who are teaching in the winter term. So what was it like teaching remotely? Let me tell you a little bit about the structure of the course I was offering. And I should say this is less of a conversation than a monologue. I'm just going to talk most of the time, although Kim may click in and ask me some questions along the way, especially if you pose them. I do want to say and underscore, do put questions in Q&A. I may not get to them in real time. I may look at them at the end, but we'll see how it goes. I have a screen, multiple screens here, so I'll look for your questions as well. So as I said, I had around 115 students, and they were really interacting with me via what you see on the screen now, Canvas, which is this learning management system, which is in a sense an electronic syllabus with bells and whistles attached. So students could click on the syllabus there and look at the syllabus, see what the course requirements are, but they also could week by week click on each module and find within that resources for each week of the term. You can see I broke it down by week. That made sense for me. We used a textbook. If any of you took art history as an undergraduate, you may have used this textbook, although it's a new version. This is Gardner's Art Through the Ages, a very esteemed book in my field. You know, Jansen was another. Some of you may remember these names from college. The book helped, I think, bind the class together across the enormous distances we really were facing physically, and trying to keep students together and, again, bind them together into a community. As I learned in the practicum, one of the tricks in trying to teach effectively in this medium is, if you can, finding the right balance between synchronous meeting, like this, meeting in real time, like a regular class, versus asynchronous recording of lectures. And I did both. Some of my lectures and video presentations, students saw like this on the screen. It's a bit like you're looking at me now, with my PowerPoint, in this case showing a map, and then my talking head at one side. And this is basically how I communicated with students the contents of the course, through the textbook and through me offering these asynchronous recorded lectures. But then I also met with students in real time, like this. This isn't a screenshot from my class. I forgot to take one, so I just pulled one off the web. But meeting with students once a week on Tuesdays, we met in this fashion. And I also delivered a lecture. And I showed the map of the world just to remind me to say, you know, I had students in Melbourne, I had students in Singapore, I had lots of students in China, students in Europe, Africa. I really hit every continent. You can tell what the big problem was with synchronous instruction is that, you know, time zones were just so difficult to manage. You know, I was lecturing to students at 9:50 to 11 o'clock on Tuesdays. And for some students, that was the middle of the night. For others, it was the evening, etc. So it was a challenge that way. And there's very little you can do except to provide some materials asynchronously. I then met on Thursdays with students in what I called open office hours for a free-ranging Q&A about the context of the class. And then my graduate student instructors, the TAs, met on Fridays with students in smaller discussion sections. So that's just the structure of the class. I should mention we were also lucky to have a virtual visit to the Block Museum of Art. One of the things in introductory art history classes we try to do is go to the museum, which in this case was impossible. But we were fortunate to have a curator from the Block come along and present a looking exercise, looking at a print in great detail. And that was terrific. So, you know, the pros of this mode of instruction were, you know, in some ways I could present the material more rationally because I could record the lectures ahead of time and think through, whereas in lecture, sometimes when you're just working in real time, you go off on tangents and you get a little lost. So that was good. And I think certainly the students, I could provide more content in a way through lectures than I normally would in a lecture. The problems, leaving aside the time zones, Assessment was really tricky. I gave them a lot of small assignments. That's what we were taught in the practica. But it meant that it was a very busy term, both for the students and for us grading. That was difficult. They had 4 quizzes, 2 papers with outlines and lots of stuff, possibly a little too much of work. But it was also difficult to make it difficult for the students. So that wasn't necessarily the easiest. Also, some students were very engaged. I got to know some students really well. Others, less so. In this environment, it's not like a classroom where you can see people. Are they showing up? Are they there? So, you know, there are pros and cons to this, but I hope that as I and others teach more in this environment, we become a little bit more attuned to both the possibilities and the challenges. So that's really all I had to say about the structure of the course. I mean, we could go into more details. I see a couple of questions. Was it difficult for some international students to obtain the textbook? Yes, we had difficulties with that. In the student in Africa had some difficulties. In the end, I think we just shipped her a book. You know, we had students in China who, for various reasons, couldn't have access to some of the videos on YouTube that I also assigned. So we had to find workarounds. We did find workarounds, but some students didn't get the textbook as early as I would have liked. So that was a problem. I see another question. How has technological developments in art history, restoration, analysis, scanning, X-rays, carbon dating changed academic study and conclusions? That's a big question. This course was an introduction. We didn't get too far into the technical sort of conservation and scientific examination of art. I mean, some of you may know we have a very forward-looking program funded by the Mellon Foundation, and I always forget the name. It used to be called NU Access, but now it's, I think, the Scientific Investigation of Art or something. It's run in collaboration with the Art Institute of Chicago and McCormick School of Engineering. It has changed art history tremendously, although I will say, like many disciplines, there are some people who are interested in, let's say, the scientific examination of materials and stuff, and there's others in the discipline who are less interested. They're more interested in the social history. I was fortunate to study with a scholar, both as an undergraduate and as a graduate student, who was very invested in the scientific investigation of art. And although it's not key to my own research, it is something I care deeply about. I think it's a very important tool, and it has transformed many aspects of art history, not everything. For example, just knowing what the materials are in a work of art can be incredibly illuminating. Where marble comes from that it produces the sculptures, you know, which you can trace it back. Dendrochronology can tell you where the trees come from and when they were felled that made panels, which of course can exclude a lot of forgeries. And the detailed sort of material science of paint and pigment can tell you a lot about the markets for the materials that artists use. So yeah, it's been absolutely transformative. I think many of our students also are attracted to conservation, especially students of a scientific sort of bent. And so, yeah, we try to introduce it. But in this course, I wasn't focusing so much on that because these students, most of them had not taken art before. At least that's the premise of the course. It's introductory. There's another question. Hey, Frank. This is Frank Pasquesi. What are some of the learnings you found that may have worked better in this unique environment rather than the traditional in-person teaching environment, if any? I think I was trying to allude that before and saying there are some pros and some cons. I think the cons are easy to recognize. I think the pros, to my mind, students actually showed up. You know, I think you can see the statistics of how students use, I'm going to show up a Botticelli, sorry. Oh, let me just say, before I get to that question, this is how every class began. I put up this slide and the title sequence was this. So the reason I did that is I thought it was important at the beginning to have a consistent sort of musical beginning and a picture to provide consistency for students, because I think in this environment I was, you know, so much of their lives is thrown up into disarray that I was trying to provide a very clear structure. But to get to Frank's point, I mean, I think as a student, I heard from students that they really treasured the ability, instead of having to show up at lecture at a particular time, they could watch my lectures whenever they wanted to, you know. So I tried to produce bite-sized 20 to 40-minute lectures. And so I gave 3 or 4 of those a week, plus the in-person one. So there is an advantage there. I think as an instructor, I can put a lot more information on them. And than I can in just 2 lectures a week or 3 lectures a week at a particular time. So I found that to be helpful, that I could go a little further in depth, and I think they actually were willing to listen to me. Now, how well they listened is unknown. In the video thing we do, you can also press, if you were to watch this after it's recorded, you can press a button and watch this at 1.7, 1.5 speed or 2, and so you can look at it speeded up. So I'm sure some students took advantage of that to speed read, if you like, my classes. The other thing is, I think some students flourish in this environment and some don't. And it's the same in person. So I say, I know there are some students who really liked the ability to interact, for example, through the discussion board in Canvas. So on Canvas, there's like a discussion board. You can pose a question, and then I answer the question. I think some students felt more comfortable participating that way, so it brought out some students in ways other, in-person teaching couldn't do as well. But I'd say my discussion boards for my in-person classes have never been used. I mean, I say they're there, but the students never use it. In this environment, we actually did have an online text discussion, which I thought was pretty interesting. So some pros. So this class dealt with early modern European art. That is from the Renaissance broadly to the Enlightenment. I mean, that's, to use the style terms or the period terms, through, Mannerism, the Rococo, the Age of Science. So it was covering these 400 years in European history. And I did try to frame at each century, I gave them an introduction to the century. So we'll get to that in a moment, but trying to somehow give them an idea, not just of the art, but also of the cultural context. But the learning goals for this class were really 4, and they're based on the learning goals that we have in the college. So first of all, and I'm showing you here, by the way, I have my slides titled, so you can see this is Botticelli's Madonna of the Magnificat from the 1480s. I'll say a little bit about it. But the learning goals for the course were, first of all, to observe, to critique, to reflect, and express. And these are the 4 learning goals that we've stated in Weinberg College are really underpinning our curriculum. So this is sort of through every class in the college, this is the structure. And so I decided to use those as a scaffold for my thinking about this class. So first of all, observing. Well, for art history, that's easy. Close looking is a big part of what art history is about. We think we look closely, but really most of the time we're just seeing, we're just letting information flow through our eyes. One of the goals in taking art history is to not let the eye fool the brain into thinking the glance is as valuable as the gaze. We're looking for people to spend time looking. So when you look at this painting, it's not just a matter of quickly recognizing what's represented, but going through what is the landscape, how do you describe the colors, the color scheme here that the artist used? How do you think about the 5 angelic figures? Are they angels? Do you see wings? Are they humans? Are they not? So there's some questions there that immediately pop into the mind. Then you've got the Madonna and Child. I think most people who are familiarity with Christian iconography or subject matter would recognize that. But in this case, we also have these adolescent figures holding a crown overhead, and there's a starburst above. And when you look at the Christ child, he's holding a pomegranate and reaching up to the Madonna's arm, and she is dipping a pen in an inkwell. So there's all these details that require not just a quick looking, and I could go much further into this, but really trying to think through the object so that you understand all of its complexity as you look at it. And this is the first stage of observing in the course. Then the question is, well, what questions do you ask of it once you've sort of looked and you've taken an inventory of this? What questions does one ask? Well, what is it made of? This is a wood panel painting. It's very heavy. It's very large. The frame is original. There's all these things you need to know. What is the subject matter? What is the iconography of this? Well, it's a little extraordinary. I mean, most of us know coming up to Christmas, whether you're Christian or not, you may know that it's celebrating the nativity, the birth of Christ. This is obviously after that, but where in the Bible do we have the Madonna writing in a codex, which was not invented really at the time, it was not commonly used at the time Christ was born. The landscape in the background is not naturally the Eastern Mediterranean. There's so many things which are rather distinctive about this. The fact that Mary is writing is actually really interesting, which I'll get to in a moment. And what is she writing? Well, you can read the actual words in that book. If you zoom into this, you'll see she's writing something called the Magnificat, the canticle. It's a canticle of the Song of Mary, which starts, "The soul magnifies, my soul magnifies the Lord." So it's all about magnification of the glory to the Lord. So there's lots of things one needs to know just at a very basic level about this object to enter into an interpretation. So the third learning objective is to reflect. Well, what does this all mean? How does a Madonna like this fit into a broader set of issues? My basic approach, and I'll just put it in shorthand, is that paintings like this and visual materials are in a sense material thoughts, as opposed to being just decorations or social facts that are reflected in works like this. These are actually a form of thinking recorded like a text is. So like a poem by a writer is somehow related to a thought recorded in a certain way through a certain set of conventions. So too, painting records a certain type of thought by an artist, but also in collaboration with, and this is somewhat different from writing, often with a patron in this period, and also with the viewer. So there's a type of triangulation of meaning between the artist, the patron, and the spectators. I'll just say my particular approach to this object. I'm fascinated by the word magnificat and magnification. At this period, this is the beginning really of a moment where Italians were using lenses in greater detail. They were making mirrors, and you may be familiar with these convex mirrors that show up in the Arnolfini betrothal by Jan van Eyck, and a little later Parmigianino's self-portrait. But these mirrors, I think the artist here is playing with the idea of the lens, and you can see the way in which this round tondo form accommodates to a type of round perspectival visualization of the figures there. But I think sort of as a play, it's almost a pun on the word Magnificat in the canticle that she's writing in the book. And finally, the final learning goal was having students express their thoughts. How do we help students put in writing and in their words, their oral words, how do they translate visual phenomena, spatial phenomena, because I should say this course also encompasses sculpture and architecture, into words, which is very challenging to take the visual world, the spatial world, and use words to wrap around those phenomena. And I think it's a very good and challenging practice for students who are looking to develop their communication skills. So I'm going to look at the questions. Peter Hong's asking, how do students get lab experience, for example, in a chemistry course? Well, this isn't, they don't have a lab experience in the same way. I'd say the equivalent with the Friday discussion sections where students got to read a text or look at a work of art or approach a certain challenge with the graduate students and then discuss it as a group. So that was really the most sort of intimate moment where they get to find their voice in a discussion. So it's more like a seminar that's appended to the lecture course. Beth Bartlett's asking, did you see any difference ultimately in the scholarship, intellectual growth of the students that you can link to the new teaching environment? I think the jury's out on that. I don't want to over respond to what I saw. The students are doing their student evaluations. There's a very low response rate right now. I just looked at them before I got on this Zoom. I would say some students like the ability to pace themselves through the material. So I think that helps some students grow as opposed, and they can re-listen, so you can rewind and listen to something I said and maybe have that sink in a little bit differently. I think the students did quite well in the course, I would say on average, so that speaks well for their growth. On the other hand, yeah, I don't think I want to extrapolate too much because I've heard a lot of stories of students struggling in this environment. So I think it depends on the discipline. I think art history is particularly well suited to this environment to some degree in the sense that it's a very visual mode of instruction, even in person. So it's something similar. So our in-person instruction is similar in structure. I think, for example, in language courses and some courses that thrive, for example, the laboratory courses, there's real problems, I think. So my experiences were good, but not sure. Yeah, I'm getting a couple of things that people want to take my course. I haven't thought about making the course available. We don't let people audit at Northwestern, but we'll think about it. Maybe there's a way. I'll have to go back and look at those lectures to see if they're worthy of, or if you'll all think less of me if I let them out, but maybe there's a way. Noel's asking, how did you manage office hours, prioritizing regime versus first come, first serve? Tough. Well, what I did is on Thursdays, I had this very open office hours where anyone could show up and it was sort of a free form thing. I also let students contact me one-on-one just if they wanted to meet. But the students were also in these discussion sections with doctoral students. And really, the doctoral students held weekly office hours for the students, and they really felt comfortable going to the graduate students. I mean, we talk a lot in higher education about, well, we want the professor, we really want, instruction by the professor, and I think students do, but when it comes to asking questions, it's really quite helpful to have the graduate student TAs or instructors, because they provide a sort of generational bridge. A lot of the undergrads felt very comfortable going to those graduate students. So let me move on. I've got a few more things to say, and then I'll just take questions about pictures, because I want to show you more now. So the course was basically chronological, moving through the 15th and 16th centuries. As some of you know, I'm an expert on 15th century art and architecture. So most of this course was outside of my comfort zone, but that's okay. I've taught it before. Looking at objects like Michelangelo's David that you see in the Accademia there in Florence, Bramante's Tempietto, and of course, Albrecht Dürer's self-portrait of 1500, one of the most remarkable self-portraits one can imagine. So we did look at, we started mainly in Italy and then moved north. We followed let's say the dominant discourse about art history, which has the dominant, or let's say avant-garde style of the Renaissance sort of passing up through the Netherlands, France to London. So I stuck with the normative narrative. We then looked at the Baroque, or the 17th century. The Baroque is a style term that's used for that, looking at Borromini's architecture and other experimental architecture of the 17th century. The great sculptures by Bernini, like this one of Apollo and Daphne from the Borghese collection. Some of you may have been there in Rome. And looking at portraits, well, what is this? Is it a portrait or is it an ideal portrait by Frans Hals from the 1630s in the Netherlands? And then we passed up into the perhaps more familiar era in terms of the concepts are familiar, but probably the art is maybe less familiar to some people of the 18th century. Looking at the Rococo, the very, let's say, frivolous and amorous and effervescent art of Fragonard there on the right, this the swing, a painting in the Wallace collection in London, which has become almost synonymous with Rococo. But we also looked at Enlightenment. If you think about the 18th century, one of the major shifts there is this new approach to knowledge. And I'm showing you Joseph Wright of Derby's experiment with an air pump and Boulet's design for a cenotaph for Isaac Newton, this ideal architecture where the humans would be tiny in this enormous monument to the great 17th century physicist, Isaac Newton, as an ideal for how one could memorialize this abstract notion of thinking. And then through the course, although it was chronological, I had several themes, and I'll just go through these and then I'll end and I'll take some questions. So as I said before, the course was not just about painting and sculpture, but also architecture. And I think that's very important because architecture is something in our own environments, I think, that we are sometimes not so attuned to. It's almost taken as a natural backdrop to our lives. In the 4 centuries I covered, the main issue is how did Europeans appropriate and reuse the classical language of architecture? And what I mean by that is the columns and pilasters and capitals and pediments that were used by Romans and Greeks to really produce their public buildings, temples, basilica, etc. And Europeans of the early modern period appropriated these, partly through the remains that they found in Rome and then later in Greece, but also through the treatise, Vitruvius, the ancient treatise of architecture that came down. And architects like Palladio, whose Church of San Giorgio Maggiore you see on the left there in Venice, is struggling in a way to figure out how do you put a temple front, a pediment, that triangular thing on top of columns in front of a church, but you've got side aisles, so you need a secondary pediment behind. So they're trying to use these pieces of architecture for new functions, for new buildings. And the same thing is true, although much more resolved, I would say, in the Burlington House in Chiswick, in Lord Chiswick House in London, designed by Lord Burlington and William Kent in the 18th century, the first half of the 18th century, which is one of those examples of, whether it's the most functional building in the world, I couldn't claim, but it certainly is a very interesting resolution of the domestic or very elite domestic function of the building with this classical language in a way that seems to harmonize and becomes the basis, as you may know, looking at this, of places like Monticello, Jefferson's Monticello in Virginia. We also looked at portraiture, and I'm just showing you here 4 examples of the hundreds and thousands of portraits produced in the early modern period. There's if one were to plot it in a data plot, you'd see this enormous growth from Leonardo da Vinci's truly transformative portrait. It's difficult to see it now because we're also accommodated to its appearance, but at its time, it was certainly very, very novel, certainly for the representation of a female sitter in such a relaxed way. The self-portrait by Sophonis Banguisala, one of the heroes of 16th century European art, who became just such a phenomenon, court painter to the Spanish royal family, very, very popular in her own period. And they're showing her skill by painting a painting within a painting. So she's painting the Madonna and Child as she represents herself at work. A very different artist at work, Rembrandt van Heijn, in the Netherlandish 17th century, where the informal portrait really took off, although having looked at these are all rather informal, but having an artist represent himself in such an informal, direct way, as if the passage to the spectator is just so free and open. And then some 18th century portraits like Gainsborough's portrait there of Mrs. Sheridan, where the whole sort of the surrounding environment infuses this woman with values. And I will say that's the basic issue, I'd say, in portraits across early modernity, is not just how faces are captured, but how the surrounding elements, how clothes, how landscape, how the elements of work all infuse the body with certain values. In the case of Mrs. Sheridan, a certain embeddedness within nature. And we looked at art theory, and I'm just choosing one aspect of art theory in early modern European art, which is anatomy, how art connected to science in very particular ways. The history of medicine is absolutely connected to the history of art, both through Vesalius, the engraving on the left-hand side, which was a way for anatomists who were performing autopsies at this time of displaying to generations of medical students what the body was like. And they needed for that a certain naturalistic approach to representation so that those students could learn relatively accurately from not just the view of the human body, but also its abstraction into representation. And then a very different approach by Susini and Perini in the anatomical Venus there. And you see the interweaving of science of anatomy with this striking figure of Venus who has a necklace, who's on a bed. It's a very somewhat uncanny representation of the anatomical in the 18th century. And I also looked through the period at various forms of ensembles, and here I'm looking at ensembles that are outside. On the top left, you're looking at one of my favorite places in the world, San Vivaldo, a recreation of the Passion of Christ in Jerusalem, in the Tuscan landscape, in sort of the countryside. Big picture, as the Holy Land, as Europeans called it, was closed off to Europeans as Islam expanded in that area, and the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, etc., the Crusades sort of failed in the late Middle Ages and Renaissance. Europeans wanted to reproduce Jerusalem in Europe. And so there's a number of these so-called sacred mountains, Sacri Monti. This one, you can go into each one of these little houses and you will see a scene, you know, the Ecce Homo or the Last Supper or the Crucifixion. And so it becomes this, it's almost like Disneyland where you go to different places and have an experience. I thought it was interesting to show you Apennino, a sculpture on the right by Giambologna from the late 16th century, and you can see the figures there. This is an enormous sculpture representing the mountains, the Apennines in Italy by Giambologna for a private garden in Tuscany, which points to this idea of sort of awe and extremes that some artists went to in the 16th century to produce a sense of wonder. And then finally, at the bottom left, some of you may have been here to Stourhead in the UK, in England, where landscape artists started looking at paintings and then reproducing painting norms in the landscape. So everything you see there in the bottom left is, I mean, it's natural in the sense there are bushes and trees and grass, but it's all created. It's an artificial creation. The bridge goes to nowhere except the house and the garden. There's a temple there that's just sort of placed there, a miniature temple. So English landscape gardening, in contrast to, you know, the formal gardens of the French in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, produced this type of fake naturalism that really was based on reflection on 17th century landscape painting by Poussin, Claude, and others. So I think I'm going to end there. We've got about 6 minutes for questions. I'm going to put the Botticelli back up, but if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A. There's no open questions right now, so now is your opportunity. And please feel free to tell me you'd like to go back and look at one of those pictures in more detail, and I can answer your questions. And if no one says anything, I'll just keep talking. Okay, so you didn't ask, or you're not asking questions yet. Oh, there's one. Why is the Mona Lisa so famous? You know, it's difficult to say. It's partly because Leonardo is so famous that I think it became so famous. But you know, there's a long history to the Mona Lisa. So Leonardo painted it in Florence. He took it with him to Milan when he moved there, and then he took it to France. He died in France. You may know his the anniversary, or the 500th anniversary of his death was last year. And because it was in France, it ended up in the Louvre. And because it was in the Louvre, which is one of the earliest museums that really spread the fame, partly because of Napoleon, it's a long history, it became so known very early on in the history of art. So it's sometimes the accidents of history. You know, I remember with my aunt, she was very invested in art. She hated the Mona Lisa. She was like, why is that important? There's so many more interesting things in the Mona Lisa. The only thing I'd say is that if you look at the portraits around, you know, what's happening before the Mona Lisa and afterwards, you do see how Leonardo was trying to do something, you know, very, very interesting and different, both stylistically, but also in terms of how one feels as a spectator relative to the sitter. But I think the short answer to your question is it ended up in France. And because the Louvre became important, it became important. Jessica's asking, thanks Jessica, how did you become interested in art history? And Mary, Mary Hahn is asking, do you cover religion and its impact? Absolutely, I should have mentioned, I think maybe that was a Freudian slip that I forgot, because the first half of the course I have to convince the students that they have to know about religion, because almost everything is about religion. I mean, we're looking at the Vatican here, even though the paintings are about classical antiquity or abstractions, understanding the basic, you know, approach to both Christianity and its iconography at the beginning, but then also religion in a lived sense. How did people use sculpture, painting in churches, etc., was essential. And then, of course, in the 16th century of the Reformation. So yes, absolutely, we spoke about that. And Jessica, I haven't forgotten your question, but it was linked to that. I think part of the reason I got interested in art was growing up in a family, you know, many of you know this, none of my family went to university. It was not a particularly, I can't pretend to have very well educated people in my family, but they were very interested in the arts, partly because my grandfather was a boxer who ended up being a model for many artists in England. And so his daughters ended up knowing artists and they were just always fascinated by it. And my mother passed it on to me and my brother. I think when I started studying in college, I didn't really know what I wanted to study, but I was very interested in classics and Latin. and I ended up in art history, and I just realized it enabled me to use my languages. I liked language quite a lot. And yet I could roam across anything. I could look at medicine, I could look at science, I could look at poetry, history, etc. So I think it was the interdisciplinarity of art history that really appealed to me. And I think, to be frank, because I was brought up Catholic in a very strict way, I knew a lot of the saints. You know, I could identify those saints without any problem. So I think I did well early on. And, you know, sometimes that makes a difference in decisions. If you, you know, happen to do well at something, you just keep on following up. So that was probably one of the reasons. Karen Kent's asking, do you have a painting or sculpture that moves you each time you see it? Something that perhaps changes your mood or vision? Yeah, I do. I mean, there's probably many. The one I'm working on, I have been working on for some time, and I don't have it here, but you can Google it, is Donatello's Mary Magdalene. It's a complex object. You might not like it when you first see it, but it's something that's haunted me for many years. So that's something that really does make a difference to me. I will say the work, most of my work has been on Donatello. It isn't clear from the from my book titles, etc. I will say Donatello is a recurring interest. Trip is asking, Trip Rothschild. Hi, Trip. Did you lecture live and record it for future viewing, or just show your recorded lecture at a specified time and, whoops, I missed that, and make it available later? I did both. So I did pre-recorded lectures, and then I did live lectures like this that then were recorded and students could watch them afterwards. So both of those things. Stan Scott is asking, over time, what do you consider the single most important influence on art and its history? Single most, oh, for a social historian like me, because I'm, you know, I was trained, I mean, I love art and I'm very invested, but I was trained as an historian. So there are so many influences. I would say that it depends on the period. For example, in the 15th century that I work on, Michael Baxendale, a very, very good art historian, said once that, you know, a work of art is it's sort of a deposit of a social relationship between an artist and a patron. But artists were professional visualizers of religious stories. And that in that period, really, it was the church, it was religion that really was the dominant force through the 16th century. And then other things start creeping in. I don't know if that answers your question, but Peter Hahn's asking, in your role as WCS Dean, have you seen an impact on the passion of the freshman class as future NU alums and potential donors? Seen an impact? Do you mean a negative impact? I'm taking it from the, you know, I think we'll find out in winter as we invite students back to campus. I think we'll see the impact of what's going on. I do think that, you know, I don't know how you feel. I think for me, the first year was a big deal because it really made me passionate about things. I wasn't, you know, you weren't already weighed down with a lot of responsibilities, extracurricular life, etc. So I'm hoping that we can make this first year as interesting and wonderful for the students as they deserve. I will say that the first year students in my class were some of the best. Make of that what you will. But I'm gonna have to let you go. If you have to go, we're over time now. If you have to leave, leave, but I'll stay around to just answer a few more questions. Barbara Kastner is asking, predictions musing for the future of Renaissance post-current pandemic. Future art Renaissance. Okay, how would you like to see the next future art period capture our current period? You know, that's a difficult question to answer. I think there's always a delicate, in modern art, there's always a delicate balance between trying to address the moment versus trying to produce something which is in some way transcendent of the moment, right? I mean, I think artists struggle with that because most artists, you know, there are different things you get out of art. I mean, architecture is different from video art, from installations, from painting. But I would say trying to figure out that balance. How do you respond to what's going on and make your art relevant now while not making it so, I don't know, let's say subordinated to the present that artists don't think about something a little bit more adventurous in the future. So I think trying to find that right balance, that's what I like in art. I do like art that addresses contemporary issues. I don't like art that escapes the contemporary too much in my own personal aesthetic. But I think it can become a bit didactic if it's only about the present day. Is the pomegranate that Jesus is holding symbolic of anything in the painting? Sorry, I didn't mention that. Yeah, it is actually. There's actually various theories of the pomegranate. You know, some people would say, well, it's just a fruit. Other people say it's symbolic of the heart. That's a complex one. I don't have to go into it, but the normal one is because the fruit on the inside is red and the color of blood, it's a proleptic reference to Christ's sacrifice. So most Madonnas and Child that you see, you don't see a lot of smiling. And the reason is most of them are in a Christian context meant to be balancing this moment of love, infantile, sort of between the mother and child, but also a foreknowledge that it's going to end in sacrifice and death. And so when you see red fruit, whether it's grapes or whether you see pomegranates, it's usually thought to prefigure Christ's blood on the cross. Carolyn Kent says she looked up Donatello's Mary Magdalene. It is a complex work of art, so I'm happy to chat about it some other time. How accessible was art to the common person throughout the time periods covered in your course? Wow, great question. Changes. It depends where that work of art was. In churches were pretty public, depending on whether they were nunneries, convents, monasteries, but a lot of parish churches and cathedrals are relatively public. So there is a public ability, focus for art in the early modern period. But a lot of the smaller things, the portraits, would have been kept very locked up for many, many years, centuries, basically. So it wouldn't be seen by many people. But you're absolutely right. Trying to figure out who saw what when is very important. Remember, one of the big changes in the period is the invention of the printing press, Gutenberg in the 15th century, and then printmaking in the 16th, 17th, 18th just explodes, which produces a truly popular form of art. So by the time you get to the 18th century, you've got popular political satire, you've got Hogarth, so it changes. Debbie Ray is saying, visiting the Art Institute, I had a young man shout, "That's not Madonna." He only knew the Madonna of the pop singer. Oops. How can art bridge this gap growing larger each day? Well, I think you use popular culture to help inform the students. Why did Madonna, the pop artist, choose to be called Madonna? Well, she grew up Catholic and she's using it ironically. And some of the iconography of her videos sort of almost is a critique of her upbringing. So there's ways you can turn it around to try and convince them. But also you just translate it. Madonna means my lady. So it's just a way of saying my lady. It's an honorific. So one more. Pete Woods says, hi Pete, with most of the important museums being closed, do you agree that digital copies of art will become more prevalent outside museums? And how much is sacrificed by seeing digital reproductions? Depends on the quality of the reproductions, to be frank. I mean, sometimes you can see more in a photograph than you can in a museum. I mean, I can't tell you how many museums you go to and the light is bad, or you go to a chapel in Florence and it's dark and you can't get the lights to work. So in some ways, photography enables a type of analysis that isn't available when you see the object in person. That's been the case since Bernard Berenson, famously just looked at photographs. Basically, that's not quite true. So you gain some things with photography, but then you also lose some things. I think, as someone very committed to the material examination of art, I think that you should do both. And I don't think museums will go out of business. The Block right now is putting all of its collections online, so you can go and see anything eventually in the Block. I think that actually excites people about going to the museum. So I think I see Kim, we've gone over time, and I actually have to go to a meeting. So thank you so much for spending some time with us. It really is meaningful, and thank you for all you do for Northwestern. If you have any questions, just shoot me an email.
Adrian, thank you so much. I know on behalf of all of our participants today, when I say thank you for these wonderful insights into both European art during the time period you study, as well as life on our virtual Northwestern campus this fall. So thank you everyone for tuning in, and happy holidays.
Happy holidays.